The evening of May 15, 2022, started like any other quiet night in Shively, Kentucky. Families were settling in for dinner, children were finishing homework, and the suburban neighborhood was wrapped in the familiar comfort of routine. But at exactly 8:47 p.m., that peace was shattered by a frantic 911 call that would haunt the responding officers forever. A woman's voice, trembling with terror, reported shots fired inside a family home. What awaited the Shively Police Department would become one of the most heartbreaking domestic violence cases in the county's recent history. When officers Martinez and Thompson pulled up to the modest two-story house on Dixie Avenue, the scene appeared deceptively calm from the outside. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry, just porch lights casting long shadows across a well-maintained lawn. But as they approached the front door, the silence felt wrong. Too heavy, too complete. The officers exchanged glances, hands instinctively moving to their service weapons. They had no idea that behind that ordinary suburban facade lay a crime scene that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family violence and mental breakdown. The front door stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the evening breeze. Officer Martinez called out, "Police? Is anyone injured?" The response came not in words but in the form of muffled sobbing from somewhere deep within the house. As they pushed through the doorway, their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing the first signs of violence: overturned furniture, scattered papers, and then the unmistakable metallic scent of blood hanging heavy in the air. What they found next would be seared into their memories forever: a mother's life cut tragically short by the very person who had promised to protect her. Cindy Burdette lay motionless in the doorway of what appeared to be a makeshift bedroom, her nursing scrubs still bearing the hospital ID badge that identified her as someone who had dedicated her life to healing others. The 38-year-old mother had been shot once in the chest at close range, a wound that would have been instantly fatal. Her arms were positioned as if she had been trying to shield herself, a heartbreaking final gesture that spoke to the terror of her last moments. Around her, the evidence told a story of chaos, panic, and a woman's desperate attempt to protect her children from unthinkable violence. In the hallway, paramedics worked frantically over a small figure, Cindy's youngest daughter, barely 10 years old, fighting for her life with a gunshot wound to the neck. The bullet had missed her vital arteries by mere millimeters, a miracle that would be the only bright spot in this horrific night. As EMTs carefully loaded her onto a stretcher, her weak whispers revealed the unthinkable truth: "Daddy did it. Daddy shot us." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, confirming the officers' worst fears about what had transpired in this once happy home. Huddled together in the living room, 3 children ages 8, 10, and 12 clung to each other with the desperate grip of survivors. Their tear-stained faces told a story no child should ever have to live through. The eldest, 12-year-old Michael, became their spokesperson, his voice barely above a whisper as he recounted the evening's events. "Dad was acting weird all day," he began, his words punctuated by the kind of trembling that comes from witnessing the unthinkable. "He kept saying someone was in the house. Mom tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't listen. Then he got his gun." While emergency responders worked to save his daughter's life and comfort his surviving children, Ronald Burdette had vanished without a trace. His pickup truck was gone from the driveway, and neighbors reported seeing him speed away shortly after the shots were fired. The 42-year-old factory worker had transformed from family provider to the state's most wanted fugitive in a matter of minutes. A BOLO alert went out across 3 states, describing a dangerous armed suspect who had already demonstrated his willingness to turn deadly violence against his own family. Time was running out to capture him before he hurt someone else. Detective Sarah Collins had worked dozens of homicide scenes throughout her 15-year career, but stepping into the Burdette home challenged even her experienced composure. The living room looked like a war zone: bullet holes punctured closet doors, shattered picture frames lay scattered across the floor, and spent shell casings marked the path of destruction Ronald had carved through his own home. Each piece of evidence told part of a larger, more disturbing story about a man's complete mental breakdown and the innocent family members who had paid the ultimate price for his delusions. The bedroom where the shooting began painted the clearest picture of the night's horror. Blood-soaked carpet bore witness to where Cindy had fallen, while bullet holes in the ceiling showed the wild, panicked nature of Ronald's shooting spree. Investigators found children's toys scattered among the shell casings, a heartbreaking reminder that this violence had erupted in what should have been the safest place on Earth for these kids. A single bullet had even pierced through the exterior wall, embedding itself in the neighbor's fence, proof that Ronald's rampage could have easily claimed even more innocent lives. By dawn on May 16th, law enforcement agencies across Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio had joined the massive manhunt for Ronald Burdette. His photo appeared on every news broadcast, his description was distributed to every patrol officer, and his cell phone was being tracked by federal authorities. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit created a psychological profile suggesting he might seek refuge in familiar locations, former workplaces, relatives' homes, or cheap motels where he could lay low. What they didn't know was that he was already just 60 miles away, holed up in a rundown hotel and wrestling with the magnitude of what he had done. The Red Roof Inn in Jeffersonville, Indiana had seen better days, but it offered exactly what Ronald Burdette needed: anonymity and cash transactions. He had checked in under a false name, paying for 3 nights up front with crumpled bills pulled from his wallet. Security cameras later showed him pacing his room throughout the night, occasionally peering through the blinds at the parking lot below. Hotel staff would later describe him as agitated and paranoid, constantly asking about checkout times and whether anyone had been asking questions about him. He had no idea that investigators were already closing in. 22 hours after the shooting, a sharp-eyed desk clerk at the Red Roof Inn recognized Ronald Burdette from the news broadcasts and immediately called police. Within minutes, the motel was surrounded by local law enforcement and federal agents. When they knocked on room 237, Ronald offered no resistance. He simply opened the door, raised his hands, and said, "I've been waiting for you." The man who had terrorized his family and fled like a coward now appeared broken and defeated, perhaps finally understanding the full weight of his actions. His reign of terror was over, but his victim's suffering was just beginning. Federal agents and local police executed simultaneous search warrants on Ronald's hotel room and his pickup truck parked outside. What they found painted a picture of a man in complete psychological breakdown. Prescription bottles for anxiety and depression medications that hadn't been refilled in months, notebooks filled with paranoid scribbling about imaginary threats, and a small arsenal of ammunition that suggested he had been preparing for some kind of confrontation. Most disturbing of all was a family photo, torn in half, with Cindy's face completely scratched out with black ink. Detective Collins spent hours preparing for what would be one of the most important interviews of her career. She studied Ronald's background, a factory worker with no prior criminal history, no documented mental health issues, and by all accounts, a devoted father and husband until recently. Friends and co-workers described a gradual change in his behavior over the past 6 months, increased paranoia, accusations that Cindy was having an affair, and bizarre claims about people following him. The question wasn't just what had happened that night, but what had transformed an ordinary family man into a killer. The sterile interrogation room at the Shively Police Department had witnessed countless confessions over the years, but few as heartbreaking as what was about to unfold. Ronald Burdette sat across from Detective Collins, his hands shaking as he struggled to meet her gaze. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes and the stubble that suggested he hadn't slept in days. A digital recorder captured every word, every pause, every moment of silence as a man tried to explain the inexplicable, how love had turned to violence in the span of a single, terrible evening. "I knew someone was in the house," Ronald began, his voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "I could feel them watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike." Detective Collins listened as he described months of growing paranoia, mysterious sounds in the attic, shadows moving past windows, and his absolute certainty that Cindy was hiding something from him. He spoke of sleepless nights spent patrolling their home with a loaded gun, convinced that danger lurked in every corner. What emerged was the portrait of a man whose grip on reality had slowly, methodically slipped away. Ronald's delusions had become so real to him that he could describe the intruder in vivid detail: a tall man, probably one of Cindy's co-workers from the hospital, someone who had been stalking their family for weeks. He was hiding in the closet, Ronald insisted, his eyes darting around the room as if the imaginary threat might materialize even here, in police custody. Cindy knew he was there. That's why she screamed. She was warning him, not me. The complete disconnect from reality was both fascinating and terrifying, a glimpse into a mind that had constructed an entire, alternate version of events to justify the unjustifiable. According to Ronald's warped recollection, the shooting had been triggered by a single, devastating miscommunication. When Cindy saw him with the gun, she had screamed, "He's got a gun." Words that Ronald interpreted not as a warning about his own weapon but as confirmation that his imaginary intruder was also armed. "I thought she was telling me the other guy had a gun," he explained, tears streaming down his face. "I thought I was protecting my family. I thought I was the hero." It was a tragic illustration of how mental illness could transform a protector into the very threat his family needed protection from. Perhaps the most heartbreaking detail in Ronald's confession involved his 12-year-old son Michael's desperate attempt to defuse the situation. As his father stood over his mother's body, gun still in hand, the terrified boy had tried to redirect his father's paranoid focus. "He told me the intruder was in the attic," Ronald recalled. "He was trying to help me find him." What the boy had actually been doing was trying to get his unstable father away from his injured sister, a heroic act of quick thinking that likely saved additional lives that night. There had been a single, terrible moment when reality broke through Ronald's delusional state. Standing in his destroyed home, looking down at his wife's body and his daughter's blood, he had suddenly understood what he had done. "The intruder was never there," he whispered to Detective Collins, his voice breaking. "It was all in my head. I killed Cindy. I shot my little girl. There was no one else, just me and my sick thoughts." It was the moment when delusion gave way to devastating clarity, when a man realized he had destroyed everything he loved based on threats that existed only in his deteriorating mind. While Ronald sat in custody, investigators worked around the clock to piece together the full scope of what had happened. They interviewed neighbors, coworkers, and family members, building a timeline of Ronald's mental decline. What emerged was a pattern of escalating paranoia that had been building for months: missed workdays due to surveillance, accusations hurled at innocent colleagues, and increasingly erratic behavior that had left everyone who knew him deeply concerned. The signs had been there, but no one had imagined it would end in such devastating violence. Forensic experts spent days processing every inch of the Burdette home, looking for any evidence that might support Ronald's claims about an intruder. They dusted for fingerprints that weren't there, searched for footprints that didn't exist, and analyzed every possible point of entry. Security cameras from neighboring homes showed no suspicious activity. Phone records revealed no threatening calls. The conclusion was inescapable. The only threat that had existed that night was Ronald Burdette himself, armed and consumed by delusions that had turned his own family into perceived enemies. As news of the tragedy spread throughout the community, stories began emerging about the woman Ronald had killed. Cindy Burdette had been more than just a wife and mother. She had been a registered nurse at University Hospital, where she had spent 8 years caring for cardiac patients in the ICU. Colleagues described her as the kind of nurse who stayed late to comfort frightened patients, who remembered every family member's name, and who brought homemade cookies to work on difficult days. She had dedicated her life to healing others, only to be killed by the very person who should have protected her. The Shively community struggled to comprehend how such violence could erupt in their quiet neighborhood. Memorial flowers appeared on the Burdette family's front lawn, growing into a massive display of roses, lilies, and children's drawings. Local churches organized prayer vigils, and Cindy's hospital colleagues established a scholarship fund in her memory. But beneath the outpouring of support was a disturbing question that haunted everyone. How had the warning signs been missed? How had a loving father and husband transformed into a killer without anyone intervening? While their father sat in jail and their mother lay in the morgue, the surviving Burdette children faced an unimaginable new reality. The youngest daughter fought for her life in the pediatric ICU, while her siblings were placed in the care of Cindy's sister in Ohio. Child psychologists worked around the clock to help them process the trauma, but the questions they asked were heartbreaking. When is Daddy coming home? Why did he hurt Mommy? Is it our fault? The ripple effects of Ronald's violence would haunt these innocent children for the rest of their lives. 6 months after the shooting, Ronald Burdette faced his first court appearance. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit and shackled at the wrists, he bore little resemblance to the man who had once coached Little League and attended every school play. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, arguing that Ronald's untreated mental illness had rendered him incapable of understanding the nature of his actions. But prosecutors painted a different picture. A man who had made deliberate choices, who had loaded a gun and pulled the trigger, regardless of his psychological state. After months of legal maneuvering and psychological evaluations, Ronald's defense team reached a sobering conclusion. Their client's mental illness might explain his actions, but it wouldn't excuse them in the eyes of the law. In June 2023, nearly a year after the shooting, Ronald stood before Judge Patricia Williams and spoke the words that would seal his fate. "Guilty, Your Honor." He pleaded guilty to murder in the first degree for Cindy's death, first-degree assault for shooting his daughter, and wanton endangerment for the bullets that could have killed his other children. August 17, 2023 brought the Burdette family back to court for the final chapter of their legal ordeal. Cindy's sister read a victim impact statement that left the courtroom in tears, describing the woman they had lost and the children who would grow up without their mother. Ronald's surviving daughter, now 11 years old and bearing the permanent scars of her father's violence, chose not to attend, a decision that spoke volumes about the lasting trauma he had inflicted. When Judge Williams announced the sentence, 25 years in prison with 20 years before parole eligibility, it felt both like justice and like a wholly inadequate remedy for such devastating loss. Today, Ronald Burdette sits in a maximum security cell at the Kentucky State Reformatory where he will spend the next 2 decades of his life. Prison records show he's been placed on suicide watch multiple times and receives regular psychiatric treatment for the mental illness that contributed to his crimes. He's written dozens of letters to his surviving children, letters that remain unopened and unread. The man who once believed he was protecting his family from imaginary threats now lives with the very real knowledge that he was the only monster. The Burdette family tragedy serves as a stark reminder of how untreated mental illness can transform ordinary people into perpetrators of unthinkable violence. It highlights the importance of recognizing warning signs, seeking professional help, and removing firearms from homes where mental health crises are brewing. Most importantly, it honors the memory of Cindy Burdette, a healer whose life was cut short by the very person who should have cherished and protected her. Her legacy lives on in the lives she saved during her nursing career and in the 3 children who survived their father's breakdown and continue to heal from wounds both seen and unseen.